O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Please be seated. Welcome, Nate. There are two of what I call bookend Sundays on our liturgical calendar. One comes near Thanksgiving, the celebration of Christ the King, the Sunday before we dive headfirst into Advent and the holidays. Today, of course, is the other bookend, Trinity Sunday. Between them, we squeeze a wild and demanding liturgical ride, but we seldom pause to think about what I think we could more accurately call these two conundrum Sundays. They are conundrums because if Jesus ever got wind of either celebration, I'm certain he would be very, very confused and perhaps even very, very annoyed. But here they are, for better or for worse, and so today I'll focus on today's conundrum. And this is a story that usually elicits the shouts of, "You've got to be kidding," about 5 minutes in. That just means you're listening. So sit back and get ready for a wild Trinity Sunday ride. The first thing I need to say about how we wound up with the Trinity as a primary doctrine of Christianity is that Christianity got along just fine without it for a very long time. Beginning with the middle of the 1st century, just a few years after Jesus' death, the whole movement of followers of Jesus was growing slowly. Yes, growing, but it appears that leadership was in short supply, and leaders were necessary if it was to grow beyond a grassroots movement. On the one hand, by then it was also, on the other hand, by then it was being spread all over the Roman Empire, but by whom we just can't really say. We're pretty sure that Jesus had his original 12 disciples, now apostles, who were supposed to take his message far and wide, along with an unspecified number of other followers who had experienced Jesus in some way or other and who may have just taken it upon themselves to give Jesus' message legs. It was growing primarily in the cities, which is interesting since it began among the peasants of Galilee. Well, one can argue that there are more possible converts in the cities than in the rural parts of the empire, so why not focus there? And according to Paul, Christians were already in Damascus when he underwent his conversion, since that's where he was going on his way to persecute the Jesus community there. There's also reasonable evidence that Emperor Nero blamed the fire in Rome in the year 64 on the Christians because they had become numerous enough that their activities were deemed disruptive and therefore rendered them easy and effective scapegoats. And the deaths of James, it's the brother of Jesus, along with Peter and Paul, and all before the beginning of the Jewish war with Rome in 66, the Common Era, point to a desire on the part of the empire to quash these troublesome followers of Jesus. By the early part of the next century, say roughly 100 on, merely admitting to being a Christian could get you killed as a criminal, depending on who was in charge where you lived. Yet with a likely population of only a few thousand Christians throughout the empire and concentrated in the cities, this was enough to get them noticed officially. We all know what that means. By about that same time, important Roman writers were issuing scathing gossip of what was reported about these Christians, noting everything from civil disobedience to rampant immorality, as if to agree with Nero that stamping out these Christians was a good idea. Well, this last bit really was a problem for the early Christians. You see, Christianity was by then split off from Judaism as a separate cult. As I noted, from the start of Christianity, leadership and with it organization was hard to come by. And so, unfortunately, some of the most disturbing allegations about some groups of so-called Christians turned out to be true to varying degrees. Not that some were doing wild things that were adopted by all Christian groups, but those groups that we'd call the outliers definitely existed, and word about what they were getting up to got back to the Roman aristocracy. Now, morality was something that the aristocracy was constantly trying to instill within its own ranks, unsuccessfully. So having noteworthy perversions take place among those at the bottom of the social pyramid was unthinkable and needed to be swept away. This, in turn, demanded some kind of response on the part of the Christians who weren't part of the naughtiness. The images that Roman society publicized about the Christian communities needed to be shown as being absolutely impossible, going against the highly moralistic lifestyle of most Christians. And complicating matters even further was the fact that in the empire, religion, politics, and everything about everyday life were all the same thing. The Roman imperial cult, the basis of their pagan religion, was responsible for maintaining the goodwill of their gods and thus the prosperity of everyone and everything in the empire. So anything that might displease their gods and incur their wrath needed to be eliminated. The Jews were far more pliable and cooperated and even collaborated with the Roman religious cult. The Christians, on the other hand, strongly resisted Roman pagan religion and society and refused to play along. In the view of one of their major critics, Christian recalcitrants merely demonstrated that Christians hated the human race. Claims of immorality aside, the Christians still had problems and needed some good propaganda if they were going to survive. The Jewish war with Rome from about 66 to 70, the Common Era, actually gave many Christian groups a break. Turning their backs on their Jewish roots, most Christians fled Jerusalem rather than stay and take up arms against the Romans. After a generation of staunch resistance against everything Roman, they were forced to choose sides, and they chose Rome. And this is reflected in the propaganda that flowed after that war, the Gospels. But with that propaganda came a new problem. In the earliest Gospel, Mark, Christians made it clear that some apocalyptic event was coming soon and Jesus would return to bring about a new kingdom overseen by the Jewish God. Still, to the Romans, this looked like just so much wishful thinking on behalf of the Christian cults, still trying to justify worship of a criminal who was arrested and executed by the Roman authorities. Paul had a big hand in getting things started, but Jesus' legend in the years after his death and after that war did what all such good legends do. It grew. And when Christian writers use terms like the coming Son of Man or the Son of God, the Romans scratched their collective heads in disbelief. In Jewish understanding, these terms meant a representative, a Messiah from God, to mediate between heaven and earth. To the Romans, who considered these terms from their own philosophical perspectives, they meant something different. In the Greco-Roman cultural religion of the day, there were many sons of the gods, not the least of them all of the emperors starting from Julius Caesar. Christian philosophy had, therefore, they reasoned, elevated Jesus to the level of a god and of some sort, and at least just for the Christians. And the Christians ran with it. all of a sudden the Gospel's aftermark began to reflect increasing emphasis for the deification of Jesus, with John's Gospel defining him as eternally pre-existent and the part of God responsible for the creation story in Genesis. And then something really weird happened. I say that with a large dose of irony. By this time, after our 4 Gospels were written, the criticisms of Christianity from Roman writers were no longer just about theological ideas, but couched in terms of the Hellenized, that is the Greek, philosophy of their time. But also new was that after John's Gospel was written, the Christian world contained new Christians, a bunch of new Christians, who had been classically trained at great expense by the same Hellenized philosophers who trained their critics. And with this came a flurry of purely philosophical ideas about the nature of this now divine Jesus. It was essentially a philosophical toe-to-toe battle. For them, theology was just a branch of philosophy after all. Now, reviewing these ideas would take way more time than I've got today. So here are 2 examples. If God, in the creation story, made the world and called it good, then why does it include things like death and suffering or even change? To the philosophers, God and God's creation should be perfection itself, and thus also changeless because it is perfect. Since that clearly doesn't describe reality even back then, it has to mean either that Genesis was wrong, or that a lesser, inept God, not the monotheistic Jewish God, was in charge of creation and screwed things up. Jesus as a lesser and inept God. Well, the Christian philosophers wrestled with that one for years, probably to the amusement of the Romans. Then there's the whole Son of God idea. Was Son just one disguise for the real God? Or as Father, did God create his Son? Or did God, as recorded in the Gospels, adopt Jesus as his Son at his baptism? Or something else? And if there was a time when God the Father was around and about to beget a Son, that means that the eternally pre-existent Son was merely a human begotten by God at some point in time. Again, you can almost hear the furious scratching of ink and stylus on papyrus as the Christian philosophers tackled these problems. And yes, there were plenty more. It wasn't until the 2nd century that a philosopher, Tertullian, just punted and said that all 3 entities, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, were of the same substance, God's substance, same substance, but of different personas. Another philosopher, Origen, early in the 3rd century, tied things up for the eternal existence of God by claiming that only the triune God could come out of nothing and be self-generating before time began. Philosophical mumbo-jumbo. But, voila! You've got a Trinity now, and the Council of Nicaea will confirm it a century later. It'll be requiring people to accept it or suffer the consequences. Constantine inherited the mess I've described when he converted, thinking naively that Christianity was a unified religion. The councils of Nicaea in 325 and later in Chalcedon in 451 tried to legislate unity, but never, ever succeeded. In fact, there were more persecution of Christians after Constantine took over than there were before, as he attempted to eliminate alternative versions of an already alternative and made-up philosophical reality. The emperor was a military man, and oppression, force, and violence were the tools he understood. And in an empire as vast as Rome's, there was always going to be Christians whose worship was defined by imperial decree as heretical. It's instructive to note that the Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410, were Christian. They were devotees to one of the more celebrated heresies, the Arians. These were the heretics who claimed Jesus to be less divine than God. Arius explained that Jesus' divinity was contingent on God and not pre-existent. By the way, Constantine agreed with this guy for a long time. Philosophers got to him and changed his mind. It's also worth noting that everything the egghead philosophers did to define God did little to promote Christianity, but did a great deal to cause great conflict and to push Christian doctrine toward paganism. In the eastern part of the empire, bishops formed militias of thugs dressed as monks to put down the riots over theology. Elsewhere, several bishops accused of heresy were publicly lynched by the empire. Yes, today represents a huge conundrum. It's shocking, to me anyway, to reflect on our collective Christian history, knowing the sorts of things I've just outlined. However, it's true. In this case, there actually were historians who wrote things down. It's just one more conundrum that there were myriad versions of Christianity in the first few hundred years after Jesus, many older and much more well-established than the version that we nowadays accept as the winner. But back then, people believed the creation stories to be real, that God's heaven was atop a dome in the sky between the earth and the moon, and that the tides were due to the sea's affinity to moonlight. But that was their world, not ours. In their world, the creeds were as such were not merely theological doctrine, but documents defining political allegiance to an empire that is now long ago dead. As one of my favorite authors notes, all orthodoxy has a shelf life. That means that even the doctrine of the Trinity must be taken out and dusted off from time to time to see if it still makes sense as a foundational document of our faith. And if we find it lacking, it is up to us to search for the answers that make sense to each of us personally. There is no empire threatening us if we do so. The shelf life of the ancient philosophical doctrines expired when those ancient philosophers died. As with everything in a post-Easter world, the rest is up to us. Jesus was not something made up by philosophers seeking power, but real like you and me. It is up to us to decide what it was about his message and his life that can guide us in our faith today. Amen.